6 ordinary moments turned catastrophic through poor judgment. These weren't accidents. They were choices that pushed boundaries too far. One careless move, one lapse in decision-making, and everything ended in disaster. These are the 6 most dumb cases ever recorded. It was February 12, 2016, in Fresno County, California. That night, people gathered in an old barn for an underground cockfighting match. The illegal event drew dozens of people who parked away from the main road and walked in quietly. Martin Rivera was among them. The 34-year-old farm worker had lived in the area most of his life, and sometimes came to these weekend fights with friends. He would bet small amounts from his seasonal farm pay. The setup was always the same: a dirt circle, men shouting and passing money, and roosters with blades strapped to their legs, fighting until one could not get up. That night, the barn was packed. People who saw what happened later told investigators that at least 30 people had come, though no one counted the exact number. The place was loud, filled with shouting and cigarette smoke. Roosters were brought in small cages, restless and noisy. Martin had his own bird ready, with a small knife strapped to its leg. Those who were there said he seemed focused on the fight, leaning close as he put his bird near the ring. What happened next took only seconds. The rooster flapped and moved in Martin's hands before he could fully put it on the ground. People who saw it said the animal moved wildly, scared by the shouting crowd. One man nearby warned him, telling him to back up because the bird was moving too much, but Martin leaned in anyway, trying to hold the bird steady. The sudden attack caught everyone by surprise. The rooster slashed out with its leg, and the blade cut deep into Martin's upper thigh. The wound was deep, cutting into the main artery. People who saw it said the injury made a heavy flow of blood. Some said it was like a broken pipe, the flow quick and strong. Martin stumbled backward, leaving drops on the dirt as he fell against a wooden box. People rushed toward him, first confused, then scared when they saw how fast he was bleeding. Several men tried to help, pressing cloth against the wound. Others yelled for someone to call an ambulance, though few wanted to bring in the police because the gathering was illegal. Stories later told to officers described the scene as wild, with people both trying to run from the barn and others working hard to stop the bleeding. Martin stayed awake for only a short time before falling completely to the ground. Paramedics finally arrived after a delayed call. They found Martin pale and not responding, with heavy bleeding from his upper thigh. Reports noted active arterial bleeding consistent with a femoral artery cut. Despite trying to stop the bleeding, he passed out in the ambulance. He was rushed to a hospital in Fresno, but the damage could not be fixed. He was declared dead during the trip. The official cause was bleeding to death from the artery cut. The time after was tense and quiet. Martin's funeral was held a few days later with mostly family and close friends there. Relatives said nothing about how he died and avoided questions about the cockfight. To them, what happened was private, and many chose not to talk about it publicly. Police used the case to go after local cockfighting meetings. Fresno County officers arrested several people who had been there that night, charging them with animal cruelty and illegal gambling. In a public statement, they reminded people that cockfighting was against the law and had serious dangers for both animals and people. The sheriff's office said this was not the first injury from such events, though it was rare for someone to die. The barn was later found empty, with no sign of the birds or equipment. People in the community said the incident was shocking because of how quickly it had turned on one of their own. Martin Rivera, a man who had spent his adult life working on farms, died in a way no one expected. Not from an accident in the fields, but from a blade tied to the leg of a bird he had brought to fight. It was November 15th, 2015, in Plzeň, a city in the Western Czech Republic. The nights were already cold, and many homes used wood stoves for heat. In one quiet neighborhood, a small workshop sat behind a family home. The space belonged to Jakub Vesely, a 41-year-old craftsman known for his very long beard. Jakub had grown his beard to extreme length, often letting it hang down past his waist. At street fairs, he sometimes braided it or tied it with cords, getting attention from visitors. Friends said he usually tucked it into his belt while working, but at home, he often let it hang loose. That evening, Jakub spent time in his workshop, as he often did. The building was small, filled with tools, wood scraps, and finished carvings. A narrow stove sat against one wall, glowing with embers. Jakub used it to heat the space while he worked. The workshop had poor airflow, and neighbors sometimes saw smoke coming through a small pipe in the roof. That night, a neighbor walking by later said he saw Jakub lean close to the stove as he added more wood. The long beard swung forward toward the flames. The man thought nothing of it until Jakub's wife shouted from inside the house, warning him to tie it back. She had often reminded him of the risk, especially in the workshop. Jakub continued his work, apparently ignoring the concern. Moments later, smoke filled the workshop more heavily than usual. People who ran in said they saw Jakub stumbling backward, his beard already on fire. They said the flames moved upward within seconds, spreading quickly. As he tried to move away, he knocked over a chair, which scattered tools across the floor. The fire then spread from his beard to his clothes, catching his shirt and sleeves. Two men rushed inside and managed to drag him out into the cold night air. Neighbors tried to put out the flames with coats and water from a nearby bucket. By then, however, his injuries were severe. Large parts of his upper body were burned, and he was barely awake. Emergency services were called, and paramedics arrived within minutes. Reports later noted extensive second- and third-degree burns covering most of his chest, arms, and neck. He was taken to a hospital in Plzeň. Doctors placed him on advanced care, but the burns had damaged both his skin and airway. The combination of smoke breathing and extensive burns left little chance of recovery. He was declared dead a few hours later. The official cause of death was listed as complications from severe burns. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly in the community. At the funeral, people whispered about the unusual nature of the accident. Some could not believe that something as simple as facial hair could have started the fire. The family kept their statements private, focusing on a quiet service. City fire officials talked about the case publicly. They gave warnings about the dangers of open flames in workshops and homes, especially when working with loose clothing, hair, or other things that burn easily. Their message said that accidents could happen in seconds and that even experienced people were not safe from risk. Safety notices were later posted in several neighborhoods, reminding residents to keep clear of fire sources and to secure anything that could catch fire easily. The workshop itself stayed closed for several weeks. Neighbors said the inside still smelled of smoke, with the stove and fallen chair left as they were. For those who lived nearby, it became a reminder of how quickly a normal evening could turn into an emergency. What began as a simple task of feeding wood into a stove ended in tragedy, showing how one missed detail can have deadly results. It was March 14th, 2017, in Dayton, Ohio. The courthouse downtown was busy, with multiple hearings scheduled that morning. The old stone building was filled with voices as attorneys, jurors, and staff moved through its narrow halls. Inside one of the courtrooms, the trial of an accused gunman was underway. One of the attorneys leading the case was Thomas Ellison, a 45-year-old defense lawyer known for bold courtroom tactics. Colleagues often said he had a way with drama, using props and demonstrations to make his point. On this day, he planned to show the jury how a gun could fire in an unexpected way. Tom's career had been steady, but not without controversy. Colleagues often described him as someone who liked to test limits during a trial. He believed that seeing a demonstration could leave a stronger impression on a jury than words alone. Those who worked with him said he was confident when handling exhibits, even firearms, though his training was limited compared to police or military personnel. During the trial, Tom asked the court to allow him to use the actual weapon tied to the case. It was a handgun that police had placed into evidence. The judge permitted it after confirming it was cleared by officers earlier in the process. Still, many in the courtroom felt uneasy when Tom picked it up. Witnesses later recalled that he waved it casually while explaining his point. A bailiff standing nearby warned him not to point it there. Tom responded that it was safe, insisting he knew what he was doing. As part of his demonstration, Tom placed a cartridge into the chamber. He believed it was spent, a casing already fired, with no live round inside. This step was meant to show the jury how easily the gun could cycle, even when supposedly unloaded. Several people in the room, including the prosecutor, shifted uncomfortably. To them, it looked careless. Still, the judge did not step in. Then came the moment that changed the entire trial. Tom aimed the weapon at his own midsection, directly at his abdomen. He pulled the trigger in front of the jury, but instead of a harmless click, the gun fired, striking him in the abdomen. The gunshot startled everyone in the courtroom. Jurors reacted with alarm, and the bailiff moved quickly toward Tom. Witnesses later said the sound was loud in the closed room, and people began moving around frantically. Tom stepped backward, dropped the gun, and held his side before leaning against the defense table. Medics stationed in the courthouse were called within seconds. They found him bleeding heavily from a single entry wound. Reports later noted internal bleeding consistent with abdominal trauma, likely hitting major vessels or organs. He was stabilized briefly and transported to a nearby hospital under emergency care. Despite surgery attempts, the damage was too severe. Tom was declared dead later that day from internal bleeding caused by the gunshot. News of the incident spread quickly. It became the focus not just of the trial, but of the entire courthouse community. At his funeral, fellow lawyers gathered to remember his unusual methods. Many quietly admitted that his style had always been too bold, sometimes crossing the line between effective and reckless. In the weeks that followed, the court system reviewed its policies. A new rule was made, banning the use of live firearms as evidence props unless they were double-checked and cleared by police technicians in advance. Judges were told to exercise stricter control over demonstrations involving weapons. Officials said that even experienced professionals could make fatal mistakes if safety rules were ignored. What began as a defense strategy meant to cast doubt on a murder charge ended instead with the death of the attorney himself, showing how quickly overconfidence with firearms can turn into disaster. It was April 16th, 2016, in St. Petersburg, Russia. A cold wind came off the river, around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the lights along the waterfront reflected on the dark water. A busy riverside restaurant hosted a private birthday party in a back room. Long tables were set with plates of food, bowls of pickles, and bottles lined up near the wall. Staff moved in and out with trays, while music played softly over the talking. One of the guests was Dmitry Orlov, a 52-year-old factory supervisor who liked to show off at parties. Friends knew he could drink hard and eat large portions, especially when there were people watching. He arrived with co-workers from his shift and took a seat near the head of the table. The menu that night was heavy and rich. Caviar, salted fish, roasted meats, potato dishes, and pastries that kept coming from the kitchen. As the night went on, the room got louder. People toasted the host, clinked glasses, and reached for more food. Dmitry joined a friendly contest with two other men over who could handle the most. Witnesses later said he kept piling his plate with spoonfuls of caviar on bread, thick slices of herring, and pieces of roast with gravy. Between bites, he lifted a glass for another shot. He said more than once that he could eat for 2 men. A waiter noticed his face turning red and his breathing getting short. But Dmitry waved off any pause and reached for more. The table around him started to slow down, but Dmitry did not. He leaned back, then forward, then back again, as if trying to make room for more. Plates were cleared and replaced with new platters. After several hours, he looked unsteady. A co-worker nearby told staff he needed water and some air. Another person at the table said his stomach looked swollen under his shirt, round and tight, like he had eaten far past full. The change came fast. Dmitry slumped forward against the table. At first, a few people laughed, thinking it was a clumsy move. But then someone noticed his lips had a bluish tint. He tried to take a deep breath and made a short, harsh sound instead. Chairs scraped as people stood up. 2 men helped him to the floor to keep his airway open. A A staff member called for an ambulance while others cleared the space around him. Paramedics arrived and found him on his back with shallow, hard breaths. Their notes later described a swollen abdomen and signs of low oxygen. They placed oxygen, checked his pulse, and moved him onto a stretcher. In the ambulance, he went in and out of being awake. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly. Later, they explained to family that his stomach had overexpanded from the large meal and alcohol. The swollen stomach pushed against his diaphragm, making it difficult to breathe. The pressure also affected the heart. Alcohol slowed digestion and added strain. A dangerous heart rhythm followed. Despite continued care, he was declared dead shortly after arrival. The official cause cited sudden cardiac failure with acute gastric distension as a contributing factor. News of the death spread through the factory before the week was out. The funeral was simple, held at a small chapel not far from where he lived. Co-workers stood in a line outside, speaking in low voices about how he always tried to outdo everyone at the table. Some said they had seen him push past his limits before. Others kept quiet and stared at the ground. Local health officials used the case to issue reminders before the next holiday weekend. Their notice warned against binge eating and heavy drinking at large gatherings. It explained, in plain terms, that a stomach can stretch beyond normal and press on the lungs and heart, especially when mixed with alcohol. The restaurant management also met with staff and adjusted their service rules for private events, telling servers to slow or stop alcohol service when a guest showed signs of trouble and to call for help sooner rather than later. By the end of the month, the private room was back in use. The long table set again for another celebration. The only sign of what had happened was a small card posted by the service door reminding staff to watch for shortness of breath, flushed faces, and unsteady movement. What started as a night of food and toasts had ended in a medical emergency. A clear example of how too much, taken too fast, can overwhelm the body in a matter of minutes. It was October 22nd, 2016, in Valencia, Spain. The Mediterranean coast was under heavy clouds, and strong winds blew across the shoreline. Weather officials had issued red alerts, warning of dangerous surf and hurricane-force gusts. Beaches were closed to the public, with patrols moving along the sand to clear anyone trying to enter the water. Despite the warnings, a few curious onlookers gathered along the walkway to watch the waves hit against the seawall. One of the men who showed up that afternoon was Carlos Ortega, a 39-year-old amateur kite surfer. He had practiced the sport for years, mostly in calmer weather. But friends said he often talked about how he could handle extreme conditions. When storms came in, he liked to talk about testing himself against the elements. That autumn, he had told several people that he wanted to ride during a major storm, saying it would prove his skill. Carlos carried his gear down to the sand, while others watched from the walkway. Witnesses later said he seemed unaffected by the warnings and acted as though he had done it many times before. A lifeguard on duty shouted at him from a distance, warning that the waves could kill him. People nearby pulled out their phones, recording as he unpacked his board and kite lines. The gusts were already strong enough to blow sand in sheets across the beach. He strapped into the harness and opened the kite. People watching said the wind tugged hard, lifting the fabric even before it was fully extended. Carlos leaned into the force, trying to steady it, but the storm gave him no time. The kite lifted sharply, and in seconds, he was airborne. Instead of gliding over the surf, the gust dragged him inland, away from the water. Onlookers described the scene as sudden and severe. The first impact came when he hit against a concrete wall that bordered the parking area. Still attached to the kite, he was lifted again, this time carried over rooftops of nearby buildings. Witnesses said they lost sight of him for a moment before hearing a crash in the distance. The kite's lines had tangled in overhead wires nearly half a mile from the beach. His body was found there, tangled among the power lines and debris. Emergency services were called immediately, but strong winds slowed the response. Crews worked carefully to reach him, cutting power to the line before bringing him down. Reports later confirmed he had suffered massive trauma from the impacts. Paramedics declared him dead at the scene. The official cause of death was listed as multiple blunt force injuries, consistent with being thrown by extreme wind gusts. News of the incident spread quickly across the region. The videos filmed by bystanders were shared online, sparking debate about risk and responsibility. At the funeral, relatives admitted to others that his love of dangerous stunts had often worried them, though they never expected it to end in such a way. The service was small, with family and close friends present, held at a local chapel away from public attention. Authorities used the case to issue repeated reminders about storm warnings. Local officials held a press conference stressing that red alerts meant conditions were unsafe, not only for swimming, but also for sports like surfing and kite surfing. Police also announced fines for anyone caught ignoring closures in future storms, explaining that such actions put at risk not just the individual, but also the rescuers who might be forced to respond. Within weeks, the beaches returned to normal activity as the storm season passed. For those who had seen the event firsthand, however, the memory stayed with them. The sight of a single kite surfer lifted from the sand and thrown inland during one of the season's worst storms remained a clear warning of what can happen when warnings are ignored and nature's force is underestimated. It was October 12th, 2017, in Leeds, England. The weather outside was cool and damp, with light rain falling through the evening. In one of the city's older brick apartment buildings, residents were settling in for the night. Inside one flat on the third floor, Michael Turner was spending time the way he often did, working with electronics spread across his kitchen counter. Michael was 29 years old and worked nights at a supermarket. With no formal electrical training, he taught himself through trial and error. Friends said he liked taking apart second-hand laptops and phones, fixing them if possible, and selling them for a small profit. He was considered handy, though people who knew him also called him reckless. His apartment was filled with power strips, old chargers, and loose wires taped together from earlier projects. That evening, a neighbor passing his open door heard him complain about one of his chargers. He said it kept sparking out whenever he plugged it in. The extension cord stretched across his counter was patched with black tape, its covering worn thin in spots. A friend visiting noticed that one adapter grew hot while charging. Michael's solution was to place it on a wet towel, claiming it would help cool it down. When his friend expressed concern, Michael dismissed it, saying it was only low voltage and nothing to worry about. As the night went on, he continued adjusting cords and chargers while his friend stepped into the next room. A few minutes later, the incident happened. While shifting one of the plugged-in chargers, water from the damp cloth seeped into the extension cord outlet. Witnesses recalled hearing a sharp crack followed by a sudden pop. The smell of burnt plastic filled the flat. At the same moment, Michael collapsed to the floor. His body shook as the electrical current passed from his arm into his chest. The friend rushed back into the kitchen and saw him still gripping the cable, unable to let go. He tried to reach for Michael, but backed off when he felt a jolt and realized the line was still live. Neighbors who heard the noise joined in, one of them calling emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but when they entered the flat, Michael was still holding the cord, not responding. Crews cut the power supply before reaching him. Their notes later described clear signs of electrocution, including burns on his hand and chest involvement from the current's path. Despite attempts to bring him back, Michael was declared dead at the scene. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest due to electrocution. The faulty extension cord and wet cloth were collected as evidence, and fire officials documented the hazards present in the apartment. In the days that followed, word spread quickly among neighbors. At the funeral, family members quietly admitted that he had always been curious but careless with his projects. The service remained small, with relatives, co-workers from the supermarket, and a few friends in attendance. Local fire authorities addressed the case in a safety bulletin later that month. They reminded residents that damaged cords, exposed wires, and makeshift cooling methods were dangerous. The statement explained that even common household electricity could be fatal if combined with water or direct contact. Officials urged people to replace damaged equipment rather than repair it without training, and to keep electrical devices away from moisture at all times. By the end of October, the flat had been cleaned out, with new tenants moving in weeks later. For those who lived in the building, the memory of the sudden crack and the burnt smell in the hallway remained. What seemed like another evening of working with electronics had ended in a fatal reminder of how one overlooked hazard in a kitchen could become deadly within seconds. Thanks for watching. But remember, every climb, every jump, carries its own cost. Click the next story if you're ready to witness another final ascent.